Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the 7th of the JAX Chamber webinar series. Today, we are talking about reopening and what employers need to know. We have two great guests for you today. They're going to go through some presentations on some tips for you guys. And then also, as we normally do, we'll spend the first half hour on presentations and the second taking your questions. With us today, we have Kevin Hyde, who is managing partner of Foley Lardner and specializes in employment law. And we have Justin Terry, president of Harden, an insurance company that does a lot of work with local businesses on a variety of issues, from property and casualty to employee benefits and everything like that. So I will kick it over. Let me get the presentation up here and I will send it over to Kevin. Hold on one second. Can you see the presentation?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. All right, go ahead.
All right. Well, thanks, Matt. This is Kevin Hyde. Glad everybody can join us today. Look forward to having this discussion with you. And Justin will lead us through the second half. And I think both he and I are looking forward to your questions. It's exciting, as Matt said, this being the 7th in a series, but to actually talk about reopening and beginning to get back to business. All of this, of course, is coming on the heels of the governor's order of last week of saying that the state of Florida has entered phase 1, which is allowing the beginning of some of this reopening. So we're going to advance through some of these slides and talk through some points, and then, of course, get your questions at the end. So, Matt, if we can go to the next slide. Well, while he's trying to advance, I'll just go ahead and start talking through the issues and we'll get to that. What we're going to be talking about today is really just an overview. And one thing that everybody has to recognize is that each business is very unique. And so while we had the broad stay-at-home orders, really the only distinction that applied there was whether you were considered an essential business. If you were, you could remain open. If not, you had the safer-at-home order. So as we go through this, really think about tailoring this to your own business. There are a couple of things that are absolutely key that, as we were talking about that. Number one is employee safety. Not only for the sake of your employees, but as we're talking about limiting the risk of potential liability as well. And that's going to be a real key to the things that we're talking about. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, nor is it an exhaustive roadmap, because, again, each business is going to be unique. But there are some good things that we can all talk about that'll give us an idea of how we start thinking about reopening. So if we can go to the next slide, Matt. So what we're really looking at is, as you're thinking about your particular reopening, first of all, understand where we stand right now. We are in phase 1 of the governor's order of reopening, which is allowing limited reopening with the exception of certain types of industries or activities, such as restaurants can have certain types of activities, limited numbers, bars can't be opened, gyms, nail salons, hair salons are still not open. But for most of us who may work in an office environment, we can start thinking about reopening. And so even more important than the various orders that are out there is how you're going to think about it in your own organization and communicate it to your employees that they will feel comfortable and safe in coming back to work. I'd say, first of all, the thing you need to think about is if you're planning to reopen and to stop working remote in whole or part, and as you're thinking about reopening your office, it's going to be very important that certain supplies and equipment be obtained, whether that be masks, whether that be hand sanitizer, probably which you had even before we all left, or if you're thinking about doing a deep clean of your office prior to reopening. With such a demand that's out there now for these types of products and services, you need to start lining those up even now. And I know in my own organization, we're looking at probably 2 to 3 weeks maybe before we're able to get all of this put together as we think about maybe a June 1 type of reopening. But whether we can even meet that is going to depend upon getting these products and services. You're going to want to spend some time thinking about training your employees about the expectations you're going to have when they come back, about observing social distancing, If you're going to have a phased approach, a staggered approach, who's going to be the first in, who's going to be the last to come back. Train them on how to undergo all of these types of procedures. How are you going to greet visitors at the door? What questions you're going to ask, etc. So a lot of planning is going to go on. And obviously you have to put this in the context of your total operational needs as well. Matt, we can look at the next one. So what are some of the things that are going to be absolutely critical? A lot of this is going to be, your best friend is going to be the CDC guidelines. The Center for Disease Control has been very active throughout the pandemic in issuing employer-friendly advice in terms of how you're going to practically work with your employees. And as we're coming back, you're going to be looking at these guidelines will be your guide star as to how things are actually going to work, as well as your local government directives. Now, as we know, Jacksonville has been a leader in both going early into some of the safer at home approach and also coming out of it. So it's going to be very important to see what the administration continues to do on that. So between the local guidelines and the CDC, those can be the two bookends that you can use to decide what to do. But obviously there's some things that we're going to all continue to do, the physical distancing or social distancing. Think about your own particular layout. How is it you're going to have staff and employees work together while still observing social distancing? Particularly, for instance, if you're an open cubicle environment or an open floor plate, how are you going to space people across that so that you're able to maintain social distancing? Are you going to use a staggered or split shift? I know that that's something that we're looking at is to who's going to come back and when. Most guidance that's going on now is that as we're thinking about the initial phases of coming back, that if possible, you would do about a 25% of your employee population coming back. By that very few number of employees coming back as a percentage, you're going to be much more easily able to observe social distancing. But think about very simple things about your break room, your cafe, your kitchen. What restrictions are you going to put on there? If you've had a weekly lunch scheduled with your people, are you going to be able to do that? Are people going to congregate in the hallways? All of those things, including how restrooms are going to be used, how elevators are going to be used. I know many of the landlords are starting to look at limiting the number of people at any given time that can be on an elevator, which obviously at the beginning and end of the day is going to make it very difficult for people to get to and from their offices. Think about what access are you going to allow non-employees? Certainly, if you're a business that openly invites the public, you're going to have to start thinking about how you're going to handle that situation. But if people are coming to your office for conferences or for meetings, what are you going to do there? CDC is recommending a series of questions that can be asked of everyone who comes into the office. Questions such as, have you been around someone who's been exposed to the virus? Do you currently have an illness? Do you have a fever? Things like this. Just a series of questions that you can use as a baseline for people to decide whether they should be allowed access to your facility. On just the physical layout side, obviously increasing cleanliness and hygiene is going to be critically important. Work with your cleaning crews now, if you use a commercial cleaning crew, to find out exactly what they did before you went out and what they plan to do as you're coming back in, and look for an increase of effort there. So all of these types of things are important, and particularly that your employees understand and know what steps are being taken, even by your cleaning crews, so that they will be comfortable that you have created for them a safe environment. And certain things that we were doing even back in March about people washing their hands, coughing into their elbow, covering their mouths when coughing or sneezing, always been important, but will increasingly be important. Matt, next slide. Now, here, some of the things that we're talking about here are getting a little deeper into the cleanliness side, and you'll have to make a decision as to whether you can do it. But particularly with regard to your employees, the EEOC has issued guidance that specifically allows an employer to do temperature checks of all employees. Before this pandemic began, that would be something that would absolutely be barred. But because we're now in the midst of a pandemic, that's something that can be done. The employer can decide whether to do that. If you're going to do that, there's some considerations that you have to think about. First of all, try to procure now a good touchless thermometer. And frankly, spend a little money and get one that is reliable. There's a lot of ones that have been put on the market recently that just frankly aren't worth the money that you're going to spend. So get a good, reliable one. Designate just a few people in your organization as the people who are going to take the temperatures, because not only for use of the machine, but also just the proper way to do it as you're interacting with employees. Decide what your threshold is going to be. One of the recommended temperatures is around 100, 100.4, as to when you would say we are or not going to allow you access into the facility. And it's critically important how you keep the records. This temperature that you're taking in many respects is a medical record. And just like you do with any other personnel file, you're going to exclude medical information from that personnel file. So your record keeping considerations ought to be, how are you going to keep individualized records of these temperatures you're taking, but which is otherwise segregated from being seen either in the personnel file or being seen in YJUICE. Many employers are taking the position, rather than actually recording the specific temperature, they would merely say, is a person above or below the threshold which is set. So when you're thinking about doing this, if you choose to do temperature checks, number one, don't make it just you're going to decide on your own who is or is not going to receive the temperature check. If you're going to do it, it needs to be done for all. That way you're avoiding singling out someone because of a perceived or real health condition. If you take the temperature, and let's say, for instance, they're actually above the recommended temperature, do not start asking about their medical history or their medical condition. Your purpose of taking the temperature was only to determine whether it was at or below the temperature you wanted to set. If you're going to allow someone in who exceeds those thresholds, be very careful in doing that and come to a real clear understanding that it is not because of a potential COVID-related symptom that is causing it to be above, because if that is the case, you're not going to want to allow them into the facility at that time. Other kind of issues to consider just from a pure employment law standpoint is, what is compensable time? For instance, if you're in a very large office and a number of people are coming in at the same time, you may have a line there of people waiting to have their temperature taken. Because they're coming to work, that's probably going to be compensable time. And so you're going to need to figure out a way to make sure that they're on the clock as they're coming in at that time. You don't want to, for instance, if it's going to take a while to do this, do it in such a way that minimizes the time spent waiting by the individuals. You also need to think about, how long are we going to do this? Are we going to do this type of practice of temperature checks or something like that for a week, a month, or how long? Start thinking already in your own mind how long that is going to go on. And probably a safe and easy thing to do throughout all of our workplaces is to not only observe social distancing, but put some type of signage up that reminds people to go into social distancing. That not only will help remind them to do what they need to do, it will also be an indication that you were trying to take these preventative steps, and potentially could be used as evidence later on if you were ever challenged. Matt, the next one. Obviously, masks are going to be a very huge issue. Whether you do or do not personally wear a mask now, you have to ask the question of, as an employer, are you going to require people to wear a mask? This is an area where we need to be very aware of what local and state guidance continues to say on that. Currently, it is not mandatory, but it very well could be. And certainly, if you are an employer that has offices outside of Duval County, and particularly in other states, you should clearly look to see what the requirements are with regard to the wearing of the mask. Think about it too, also what your own industry standards are, the type of business that you run. What is your industry suggesting as to whether masks should or should not be worn? Unless there's a safety risk in wearing a mask, and that'll be a very rare occasion, it's probably good practice to require the wearing of the mask, just because it shows you're taking the greatest lengths possible in order to be safe. We're going to also need to make sure that you comply with OSHA requirements and continue to watch the guidance on the requirements for wearing masks and observing other personal protective equipment if you're in an industry that does require that. Overarching on all of this is the fact that all employers have a standard duty of care. Now, that's going to vary between employers, vary between industries, but OSHA says that all of us have an obligation, a duty to provide a safe and clean workplace. And so we have to decide what's the best way for us to achieve that for our own particular workplace. And obviously, employee communication about this is going to be key. And you may even reach into situations about what are you going to do with the employee who refuses, if your organization requires it, if the employee refuses to wear a mask? What if they don't observe social distancing? Can you discipline an employee for that? Can you take action against them? And the answer is yes, provided that you've properly communicated what the expectations and requirements are. Depending on your industry, you may look at other things like the wearing of gloves, goggles, or face masks, and certainly that will play into the healthcare setting. Next one, Matt. Travel in business meetings are going to be greatly changed for who knows how long. I know many organizations, including our own, is requiring approval for any type of travel, and travel is only to be done if it's for essential requirements. And that definition of what is essential is probably going to change over time, but right now it's fair to say that travel in most employers is probably going to be very limited, particularly if that travel is going to take a person outside of the country. If you have international travel planned or travel planned to some of the states with the greater number of cases, for instance, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, look at guidelines. One of the things to be aware of, you may have an employee travel to another state, and when they come back in, they could potentially be subject to quarantine by virtue of where they had traveled. For instance, in the state of Florida, we're still under an executive order that says if a person comes from one of the tri-states, New York, New Jersey, or Connecticut, or Louisiana, they are subject to 14-day quarantine when they come back. So be very careful as your employees are thinking about traveling as to what restrictions they might have either going to those places or when they come back. And really the thing to think about is it absolutely essential and necessary at this time? All of us have become very used to, as what we're doing right now, a video conference, using that, maybe scheduling in-person meetings later out, or trying to schedule meetings with fewer number of people. All of those things will become necessary as you're thinking about how you're going to safely allow your people to conduct their business. Justin will be talking to us, I'm sure, on some of the insurance issues that might be aware of that as well. Next. We've alluded a little bit to this, but as you're thinking about how you're going to bring guests or visitors into your facility, this is going to be extremely important because the guest really ought to be subject to the same entry criteria as employees, whether that is the taking of temperature, which some retail businesses have already started to do, or asking them a series of questions about potential exposure they might have had. It's again going to be very important to have an established and uniform operation and method for your business. For instance, what good does it do if you test all your employees with a thermometer and yet you have people coming in and out daily who are members of the public who aren't undergoing the same types of checks? You're still risking the potential spread by not doing a full check all the way around. And as you're doing these things, think about what kind of records that you're going to be able to keep to show that you are observing this duty of care in performing these safety measures. Next, Matt. Same thing you're going to have if your delivery services or vendors are coming in, identifying, for instance, centralized places for drop-off and pickup, and you're probably already doing that, thinking about how you could possibly receive these deliveries without much contact at all, and of course, how you're going to use sanitation to handle that, whether areas to be wiped down, tools for opening packages, who's going to be allowed to open packages, how often that person is going to be washing their hands, etc. As we've all become very acutely aware of, it's limiting the risk of exposure as much as possible. Just a couple more things to think about if we look at our next slide. Just because we are in a pandemic right now and we're all dealing with situations that we have not dealt with before, that doesn't mean employment laws are necessarily forgotten or in some cases even relaxed. For instance, I gave you the example of the EEOC is taking the position that you can do a temperature check, which formerly would have been disallowed. That doesn't mean that you can now launch into a full-blown medical examination or inquiry of an employee or an applicant. The Americans with Disabilities Act, for instance, would still prohibit that. Obviously, all of the things that relate to discrimination or harassment, things that are said or done in the workplace are still very much into play. And if you're a business that's had to think about either furloughs or layoffs or recall of employees or termination of employees, you want to make sure that any protected class is not being impacted in a disproportionate way. One of the things that we've seen a lot of while this has been going on is the accurate recording of time and hours worked for non-exempt employees, to ensuring that people are properly recording their time and being paid properly, particularly where overtime laws are being implicated. And some of you may have been, depending on your size, if you're under 500 employees, may have been starting to deal with the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, where whether that be the Paycheck Protection Act or other things that you can do with regard to paying your employees, whether they are subject to the Extended Family Medical Leave Act under the Families First Act. Dealing with leave issues is going to continue to be very important, because remember, even as we're now rolling back in, the Extended Family Medical Leave Act and the Family First Act all goes through December 31st of this year. So we're going to still be dealing with it for another 7 months or so. And if you are in a situation to where you have had to lay off employees, you'll always want to consider whether the WARN Act is implicated, which very basically comes about when 50 or more employees at a single site are being laid off for a period of more than 6 months. One last slide, and then I'll turn it over to Justin, and then we'll have our period of questions after that. This is some resources, and I think this, Matt, this is going to be available to people, the presentation, and you can click on these links here. As I said, CDC fact sheets, employer guidance are very good. They have a coronavirus resource center which collates this information. OSHA has put out guidance of its own dealing specifically with the COVID-19 issues. Obviously, the White House Task Force has put a lot of information out. Governor DeSantis has really been good about getting information about his reopening plans. All of those are very good resources just to look at if you have a question, to get some basic information. Many of these are presented in frequently answered questions format, so it's a good Q&A that you can probably find answers to many of your most basic questions. But the point about all of this is, as we think about coming back, we really need to think as broadly as possible. It is not just a matter of simply opening the doors and returning people to the desk. Our duty to provide a safe and clean environment, both for our employees and our visitors or customers or clients, is something that we all have an obligation to do. And hopefully this very high level view that we just gave is a beginning of something you can look at. And of course, we're always going to be able to answer your questions and can get in touch with us or whoever is the best one to answer it for you. So good luck with that, and look forward to turning it over to Justin right now.
Kevin, thank you very much. You know, it's been a pleasure to be friends with you the last 15 years, and you know, the information you brought to bear, highly consistent with kind of the things we're seeing, looking at, and guiding people on. So what I tried to do is take kind of what Kevin's presentation delivered and build some wraparound materials and maybe some additional resources that we can offer to just kind of go with and support that. So Matt, if you'll go to the next slide. Justin Terry, I'm the president of Harden. I've been with Harden 20 years, and I've been in Jacksonville 20 years. We are headquartered here, and you know, the great thing about being headquartered in Jacksonville is the majority of our employees anyway, as well as the majority of our shareholders live, raise families, and consume goods and services locally in this community. We're the largest independent firm in the state of Florida as an insurance consultant and broker, and we have a very large market share in North Florida. I think roughly 70 to 80% of our clientele are based in this area. And so for our customers that are watching, as well as, you know, others that might not be, we just say thank you for the opportunity to serve you, and we hope we can continue to do that. We're very deeply vested in this community and are very interested in seeing it reopen successfully, and want to do our part to help out in any way we can. So with that, if you could flip to the next slide. As Kevin said, we have the benefit of working with probably about 1,600 clients in the North Florida region. From an industry standpoint, we work across the majority of industries that work in our space and in our region. We see very customized reopen strategies, as Kevin was saying. It's not consistent necessarily by industry. It's not consistent by individual stakeholder needs. Everything is adjusted based on kind of the individual specific needs of the business leaders, the goals, their objectives. their capacity to work remotely. I mean, you know, the reality is some businesses work remotely a lot more effectively than others do. And really, you know, people are trying to be more consistent across business units. So we're seeing a lot of larger national companies that are headquartered elsewhere, and they're probably going to be slower to reopen if they have large presences in New York City or in other hot spots, because they're going to be more sensitive to being consistent across their entire operation. And quite frankly, we're seeing, you know, if you look at our clientele, our largest customers have, you know, 10 to 40,000 employees. And they've got human capital and financial resources that our small customers just don't have. And so the reality is every customer, every consult we do, we kind of have to understand their unique position before we can really give them meaningful guidance. What I will say too is that every piece of guidance we have to give has to be very flexible and dynamic. Guidance we were giving 2 weeks ago is kind of outdated today in a lot of ways, in a lot of situations. For the first couple of weeks of the pandemic impact, I felt like we were really consulting with customers week in, week out, because it was just changing so fast. Some things we're really seeing too is that as you're working upon thinking about how you reopen, how you do things, you really got to adjust to emerging risk. I mean, risk that were contained within office environments or within kind of single location situations, when they're now all of a sudden spread out, we're seeing a lot more demand for training and for IT resources, because cyber liability and the hacking attempts have gone up a lot. And so, you know, everything you look at, you got to look at the entirety of the operation, and things you just may not, a lot of businesses just haven't thought about. They're having to consider as risk today that they didn't consider before. If you could flip to the next slide, Matt, thank you. What we're hearing is we're getting feedback from, I mean, Kevin kind of said some of this, but I'll say it myself. One critical thing to do is get feedback from all your constituents. Think about who your customers are. Think about who your suppliers are. Think about what your employees' needs are, and really try your best to put yourself in their shoes. If I look across the businesses that I have membership with, our family has membership with, I can tell you some great examples of like Adventure Landing or the zoo or the YMCA. They're surveying their constituents. They're trying to get feedback from their constituents in terms of what would make you comfortable. What are you looking for? When do you want us to be open? There was an airline, I think it was Frontier, that kind of made a little bit of a mistake where they started selling the middle seat if you wanted to be more socially distanced, and that went over terrible from a public relations standpoint. And they've now gone back and changed that and said, okay, we're going to take out the middle seat. We're not going to make you pay for it. I think really trying to put yourself in the different constituent shoes, trying to communicate and collaborate with them, it'll help you avoid things that maybe you're just not thinking about from the context of that other party. You're really thinking about it too much from only your own perspective. So the more you can collaborate and communicate, the better. Kevin touched on health checks. We're seeing people do health checks in a couple of different ways. We are seeing some people hire third-party healthcare screening companies. We've got resources available for that. That certainly seems to mitigate some of the liability of doing it in-house. We're seeing some people use kiosks or as Kevin said, the temperature guns, and training people in-house to do that. That can be a fine solution. We're seeing some people just use questionnaires and surveys and trying to train their employees on what things to be looking for, and maybe have them complete a questionnaire each morning about their own individual position. So there's a variety of different tools, and it's a matter of how much confidence levels do you want to have? How much are you willing to invest? How does that work for your workforce and maybe for your guests? We're seeing those same health checks being used for guests, visitors, and customers at times as well. So a lot of different ways to do it. A couple other ideas that go around what Kevin said. We're seeing property owners and landlords really looking to increase the air ventilation within their buildings and trying to tighten up the filtration systems where they can. I mean, there's limitations to what you can do there, but the more you can filter and ventilate the air, the safer the environment should be. And then we're seeing people really do particularly people that serve the public, trying to find ways to better communicate the risk in order to say that they were reasonably warned of the risk before they engaged in activities. So if you're a child serving organization and you want to let people back into your organization so that the parents can return to the workforce, What are the things that you need to do? Do you need to post warning signs? Do you want to get people to sign waivers? There's just a whole host of risk transfer and risk mitigation measures available. And again, it's all customized based on the individual needs of the business and the risk that it presents. One of the other things we're seeing and suggesting people do is just assume you're going to have a positive test in your environment. Go ahead and be prepared for it. Think about how you're going to communicate it, who you're going to communicate it to, because when it happens is not the time you want to start thinking about preparing that communication. So the earlier you can do that, the better. And hopefully it never happens in your environment, but from what we're seeing, it looks like it very well may, and you should be prepared for that. And again, these are just things you want to try to think about in terms of trying to be reasonably prudent, trying to protect your employees, protect your stakeholders, and trying to avoid the ability for the plaintiff's bar to come at you with a negligence claim or mitigate that risk, if you will. So if you could go to the next one, Matt. We've put a lot of resources onto our website. We've sourced them from a variety of resources. We've built some, and a lot of them are form fillable for a small business that needs a standard template that they don't need a highly customized approach to. You can go pull it off of our website. You can put your name on it. You can read it. You can make determinations on what adjustments you need. Of course, our advice would be that if you really want to protect yourself, you ought to advise or connect with your legal counsel and get their final review. But for some businesses, that may not be practical, and you have the ability to access those resources. They're free. They're on our website at hardeninsight.com. And we're updating it daily. We've got a COVID task force that meets twice a week. We were meeting daily the first couple weeks, and now we're meeting twice a week. And we're looking at new resources, new guidance, things our clients need, and we're trying to put the most broadest resources available on the website. And then we've got a lot of very specific resources tailored toward industry segments or specific niche industries, and we have those available too, and we're happy to share any of that. But just some examples, we've got an employer's guide to COVID-19. It's a 60-page document that walks you through from beginning to end, kind of all the things that we see as issues an employer might be facing. We've got a return to work action plan. I mean, we've got a workplace preparedness checklist. Just some examples specific to this presentation. And then we've got some resources for very specific needs, i.e., here are some third-party healthcare companies that are available in this market that if you want to access them, here's how you get in touch with them. So again, resources there, we're trying to keep that up to date, and we found that was the best place to store the resources that are available to the public. And then we've also got a lot of insurance carrier and industry best practices. So we work across a lot of different insurance companies that operate worldwide, and we operate across a lot of different industry segments. And many of our professionals are engaged in the trade associations related to the client segments that they serve. And so we've been warehousing internally a bunch of specific resources. And we have access to a lot of those resources as well. So again, just feel free to get in touch with us. We'll be glad to provide that. What we've been doing is we've been building an internal checklist and guidance for our colleagues so that every time they come into a new situation, they kind of have a list ready of all the things we've found that may be helpful for our customers. So I think a little bit like Kevin, we found that we were talking before the meeting started, we found that a lot of our business developers, a lot of the time they used to spend going to traveling and going to industry segment meetings and going to chamber meetings. A lot of that time is free now, and we're happy to use that time to help any chamber member who needs our help. Whether you're a client or not, it doesn't matter. You can just send me an email, and based on what your business does, I'll be glad to connect you with the appropriate resource within Harden to give you access to the things that we do and the thought leadership that we have. Matt?
Great. Well, thank you both for your presentations. We really appreciate it. We've had a bunch of questions rolling in, so I will not delay in getting to some of those. The first one, and I know you touched on this a little bit, both of you, but this one is probably best for Kevin. Kevin, if someone tests positive in the workforce in my business, do I have to test everyone with whom they've worked and come in contact with?
The answer is no, and this is when you really want to go to the most current CDC guidance, because a month ago, 45 days ago, the answer would have been yes. CDC has continued to evolve its guidance on that. So some of the things you're going to want to look at is, for instance, I'm going to use an example. If the person who tested positive worked on a factory line, you might test the people on either side of them, as opposed to having to test everybody in the workplace. So one of the things that you look at is what's the proximity in which they work, who are the regular people they came in contact with. But the answer to the question is no, you don't have to test everybody, but use a reasoned approach to think about who they might have come into contact with. And again, go to the CDC guidance because it's really evolved in how it's been thinking about that.
Okay, great. And Justin, one question. Why doesn't business interruption insurance cover the shutdown from COVID-19?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, there's not absolute certainty in the answer to that. The general consensus is that and the way the policies were designed is that the policies, insurance is a pooling mechanism where a large group of people come together and effectively share resources for the claims that happen amongst the members. That was how it originally evolved from hundreds of years ago. And the general exclusions are things that are beyond the scope of the industry to underwrite and actuarially manage. And so things like acts of war or terrorism, they're traditionally not insured through traditional commercial insurance means, and pandemics typically fall in that same space. Now, at the same time, we are seeing some, at the state and federal level, we're seeing some discussions about legislation that could potentially change that. And we don't know that that'll play out. We're not really expecting that. But because of that uncertainty, and because of the legal community testing some of the business interruption denials in courts around the country, we do generally think that if businesses were impacted by the COVID-19, meaning their top line dropped and they do have business interruption coverage, we do think it's reasonably prudent to file a business interruption claim, even if we don't anticipate it being covered by the commercial insurance today, but more so to protect your interest in the future in the event that something were to change. So that's kind of the guidance we're giving our customers right now.
Okay. And I think, Justin, you mentioned this too, and so this is for either one of you. You mentioned that some employers were hiring a healthcare provider to test folks coming or to check temperatures, but if somebody hired a healthcare provider to test all their returning employees, would that mitigate their possible litigation risk if someone in their office gets sick?
It helps. I mean, the key thing here is that you want to show that you are taking reasonable steps to provide a safe environment. I don't want to give the idea that it is an absolute free pass if you do that, but it's a measure that helps. Just like if you have the hand sanitizer and you require the questions of everybody who comes in, you're showing that you're acting reasonably and responsibly. Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I mean, we've already seen liability claims by plaintiffs' attorneys coupled with claimants, particularly in some of the venues that are the most plaintiff friendly in the country, and I anticipate we'll see more of that. You can't prevent somebody from coming after you. What you can do is you can prepare yourself and mitigate that risk to the highest extent possible. Some other things we're following out of Washington, D.C. are through our Council of Insurance Agents and Brokers. We get a nightly update on all the legislative affairs that are coming out of Washington relevant to the insurance industry. And there is some reasonable talk about some liability waivers for businesses that are reasonably prudent relative to their efforts to protect against COVID-19. And now it hadn't happened, it hadn't passed, but it does seem to me that might be a good step in the right direction for business.
Yeah. One question we had is, what are best practices to address employees who may be high risk or have compromised immune systems? And part of the question is, I think, is a lot of employees may have never disclosed this before because it just hadn't been an issue. So how would employers deal with that now if someone is expressing concerns about coming to work because of being high risk and something that's not necessarily wasn't known before we entered the situation?
You know, and that question, Matt, is going to come up a lot. Remember that the current executive order from the governor that we're under, it's 2091 is the number of it. It says that individuals who are senior citizens, which is typically thought to be around 65, or who is a high-risk individual, and it goes on to list a number of health indications, asthma, obesity, diabetes, heart conditions, cancer treatments, a number of things that put people at higher risk. What that says right now is that that person should stay at home. And so if the person identifies that they are in one of these risky categories, risky being risky, higher risk of getting COVID, that's something that the employer ought to look very strongly at, because the current condition is that that person shall stay at home. And so there's an entree to have a conversation about it. What you don't want to do, and this is what we were talking about with the Americans with Disabilities Act, is to go up to an individual and just based on your own perception, whether it's correct or not, and goes up and say, hey, I think you have XYZ, don't you want to stay at home? Because then you're reacting to the perception of an impairment in your own mind, potentially, or perception of a condition. So it's going to be a balancing act. You can mitigate that just very simply by saying, are you comfortable coming to work given the current pandemic that we're in, and see if that leads them to have a discussion about why they may or may not be comfortable coming to work, but you haven't made a direct medical inquiry on your own.
Okay. And could either of you discuss if there's any release forms that employers should be using with their employees when people are coming back to work? Is that a recommended practice, or is that not worth it?
I'm not sure there is a release form per se right now that could be used, because under the law, there are certain claims that can't be waived. For instance, we could not write a release form that says, I release you for any liability of not maintaining a safe workplace. OSHA does not allow something like that. One thing that we have done with some of our clients is to provide a disclosure form, for instance, that says, here's what the governor's current order says. And particularly the 2091 talks about the distinction between those who shall stay at home, those who are encouraged to telework, et cetera. And it allows the employee to make an informed choice based on information that is otherwise available. But in terms of a pure release, which would condition against liability, in most instances related to this, it's probably not going to work, because as Justin was talking about, it's really that standard of care. What are you doing to provide that good workplace, of doing the temperature checks, et cetera, that shows that you're aware of providing a good and safe workplace.
Yeah. And Justin, you had talked a lot about what we do to get the offices ready and things like that with masks and that sort of thing. You guys know, can employers require masks even if the city or the state is not requiring people to wear masks when they're in public? Can an employer govern that in their own workplace?
I think so. I mean, my understanding is that some retail environments are requiring it today. My understanding is Costco won't let you into their stores without a mask on. And I do think that you can reasonably govern that. Now, I don't know what the law would say, Kevin, if somebody really wanted to challenge that, but
it can be a condition of employment, assuming that you're tying it to a risk, and the risk is there. So yeah, it can be a condition of employment. The only exception I would make is if, for instance, the person were working around machinery or something like that, where there's a risk of it getting caught in the machinery. But your general office environment, you could say it's a requirement of employment that you wear the mask.
Okay. And a lot of our business owners and members, they operate a business in leased facilities. So some questions that we're getting is, what if they have safety standards that they would like in their business and their landlord isn't putting those in there? Is that grounds to break a lease, or how would a business owner handle that kind of situation?
I don't want to go so far as to say it's grounds for breaking a lease, but certainly you could raise it with your landlord maybe seek to renegotiate certain terms of your lease if they're being resistant to it. I've got to believe, particularly in your larger commercial office buildings, that that's not going to be that much of a problem. For instance, our office is in the Wells Fargo building, and I've noticed already increase in signage, hand sanitizer stations everywhere, signage about number of people on the elevators. The buildings have not only an obligation, but they have a reason to want to make it as safe as possible. But I'd say the first instance, go talk to your landlord about that. For no other reason, your landlord's going to want the tenant to stay as much as possible. And the tenant doesn't want to have to weigh that against a risk of whether they're subjecting their customers or their clients or their employees to what they perceive to be unmitigated risk.
Yeah, and I mean, I think further to that, I think if those things were documented to the landlord and they didn't act on that, it would be a very difficult position for them to be in if they were reasonable and prudent. And I mean, we've got a real estate practice group that's advising a whole host of landlords on issues like that. And we had a webinar on that about a week and a half ago. And I think, you know, that very few landlords or property managers could today adequately say, I'm just going to turn a blind eye to this. It'd be difficult to do, and I don't think it'd be very prudent.
Okay, thanks. This is back on the employee side. If someone has an employee that's very adamant about staying home, should the employer allow this without asking for validation? And how far can an employer go to require somebody to come into work?
The first question that's going to come up is, how necessary is it for the person to actually be there? For instance, if the person has worked effectively in the last 8 weeks doing telework, and we are now saying you must be there in order to perform your job, the question is going to be, how could they perform it effectively the last 8 weeks, but now you're saying they have to be there? That being said, the employers can make expectations for attendance, so it's going to be a balancing act. For instance, if the employee is expressing a reluctance to come in or a refusal to come in because of what they are saying is a health condition, the ADA is going to say that you're going to need to accommodate that individual. If the employee, for instance, on the other hand, only says, I'm fearful of coming in, then you can be more adamant about them coming in because of the steps that we've been talking about that you're providing for safety. Just in one sense, every employee always has to decide whether they're comfortable coming to work or not. Now it's related to a particular issue. So really make a distinction between if they're expressing either a fear or a reluctance or a preference as opposed to a real medical need. And I would encourage you, if you're starting to make those types of fine line distinctions, make sure you talk to your legal advisor or someone else, because you really are digging into the fine points of the Americans with Disabilities Act and OSHA and things like that at this point.
Okay. And I know that both of you work with a variety of companies in Jacksonville. What are you hearing in terms of some of the businesses in terms of phasing opening, like how long some of these phases are thinking, and what are you hearing is kind of best practices from some of your clients?
You know, I'll go first, Kevin, but I mean, I'm sure you've got some different groups and different perspectives. I mean, it really just varies based on the need of the business. I mean, the businesses that have been decimated, they're trying to get open as fast as they reasonably can. But obviously, if you get open and you can't attract employees or customers, you're really not open. It doesn't do you any good. So they're having to kind of balance that. And then you've got other businesses that quite frankly, I mean, a lot of professional services businesses are looking at it saying, you know, we while not ideal, it hadn't impacted us as much as we thought. And in some ways, maybe we learned some good things from this. And I think some of those groups are going to be on the slower end of reopening. And we're seeing people, I mean, we've got some that are starting a phased reopening immediately. And then some that are saying, hey, you know, September 1st, we're telling people we're going to start thinking about it then. So, I mean, it's just the breadth is very wide. Kevin?
Yeah, we've seen kind of the same thing. I think many businesses, particularly your retail, your restaurants, are trying to reopen it, but obviously it's going to be on a reduced capacity. In terms of more of your professional services or office environment, I've heard mainly that first opening is going to bring in about 25%, go for 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks in that phase, so that maybe after 6 weeks you're at 50% capacity. And then if you're just thinking about it, back to full-blown capacity, it's probably going to be late summer, September 1-ish till people are truly back to full-blown. But again, there's, other than the particular governmental orders, there's no hard and fast rule on this. So again, you need to monitor the orders that are out there. And frankly, look at your own place, as we talked about, is can you still observe the social distancing and the safety measures when you're bringing people back fully? So you're going to have to look at it just all throughout. But, you know, I think people are going to do like a 25%, 50%, see how that goes, and then only then think about going to maybe 100%.
Matt, you may also know, you may have more of this than Kevin or I, more updated information, but I know that the mayor has a committee of people looking across various industries across Jacksonville, and they're bringing together recommendations from businesses to make recommendations on what that looks like, how it might work, to give some more local guidance to the national and state information that we have. And I think that's maybe going to be released tomorrow. Is that, do you know, Matt, if that's still on track or where we are with that?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly when it will be released, but I know that they have had a lot of folks working at that, because there are, you know, restaurants have a lot of different, you know, restrictions and needs than manufacturers do, and then do, you know, financial services where there's a lot of folks that can work remotely, and it's been successful. So it's really, you know, that's one of the great things about Jacksonville's economy is there's so many different businesses. It also kind of makes it hard sometimes when you're trying to have a blanket rule as to who can do what, because, you know, it applies differently to a lot of different people. And I know that some of the folks will be looking at, you know, if they have enough personal protective equipment for employees, you know, and for, you know, customers, and kind of what they're doing there. So I would expect something either, you know, this week or next on that.
Okay.
Let's see here. And there's one more question, employee related, Kevin, on, so if you have folks that are high risk, that are 65 and older, and they're asking to come back, can you allow them back?
Yes, you know, again, when you know them to be in high risk, this is when you can talk about whether they can safely do that. The ADA has an exception that says a person does not have to be accommodated if they pose a direct threat to themselves or others. So for instance, if by coming back into the work environment, it poses a direct threat to them, you could potentially deny them. Let me be real careful in saying that that is an extraordinarily high bar under the ADA. So before you make that determination of barring someone, you need to really evaluate all of the potential alternatives or accommodations that could be made to help allow that person to come back in. But ultimately, if they are posing a direct threat to themselves or others, the ADA says that they don't have to be accommodated, and by your question, being allowed back in. But just understand, again, that's a very high bar.
Okay. Great. And we're kind of coming toward the end here, guys. Is there any anything that you guys, like, last tips that you might have for employers, or anything that we haven't covered?
If you are involved in an industry group, and certainly the chamber has a lot of great information, but particularly your very industry specific groups, you're likely to find some good resources there, because your competitors, your colleagues, your people in similar businesses, they've probably thought of issues that you haven't thought of, and vice versa. It's a good sharing opportunity there. I know there's groups even among law firms talking about ways that law firms are going to approach it and working with the courts. And so industry specific groups are good, as well as the general information that might be out there.
I agree. And I mean, I think in addition to that, I think, you know, calling your you know, staying connected with your professional service providers. I mean, you know, we've had more interaction with our customers over the last 8 weeks than we probably typically do in a year. And I think the opportunity to help. And I mean, everybody's kind of got a we're all in this together mentality. And I think, you know, a lot of things that maybe we would have kind of held a little tighter, we're sharing very freely now, and just anything we can do to help. And I think you're seeing that even amongst competitors and friendly competitors anyway, in terms of just, hey, here's what we're doing, how are y'all doing it, and how are we going to get back on track together?
Yeah, because so much of this is completely untested. When we talk about uncharted waters, they are. You know, there is no playbook for this right now. So the sharing of information is very valuable.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that's kind of one of the things that we've seen when we've been doing these different webinars. We have them, so just if you're watching this, they're all recorded. They are on the Chamber's website at our COVID-19 business resources page. Some of them end up getting outdated as we go along. We've had a couple with the SBA, and we have a lot of resources and forms up there that we're continually keeping updated, so businesses have the most up-to-date information. I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor for this webinar, the Jim Moran Institute for Global Entrepreneurship. We really appreciate your support. To learn more about the Jim Moran Institute, please go to jmi.fsu.edu. And again, I'd really like to thank Kevin Hyde from Foley Lardner, and also Justin Terry from Harden for their time today. And thank you everyone for watching. Take care.
Great. Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it.
Thank you.